You will not see it disappear until you no longer have a choice. In this video, you will see 9 canned foods disappearing in that way, and more importantly, how they are actually used to extend, save, and maintain stability when things begin to change. You still walk into the supermarket. Everything looks normal. But if you look closely, there are slightly fewer choices, slightly higher prices, and you start buying what is left instead of what you want. That is how shortages begin. In 2026 alone, nearly 7,900 retail stores in the United States are expected to close. But the problem is not the stores that disappear. The problem is what is disappearing from the stores that remain open. The problem is not running out of products, but no longer being able to buy what you are used to. Food does not disappear all at once. It fades out gradually, quietly, steadily. And while most people do not notice, another group has already moved ahead. Stay until item number 5. Because there is something that has existed for more than 3,000 years, but is now disappearing in the exact form you need. 9. Canned sardines and mackerel 3 years ago. A quality can of sardines cost around $2. Today, the same product, $4 or more. Doubled. I have a friend, 62 years old in Florida. He never really prepares anything. Works late, does not like cooking. There are always a few cans of sardines in his cabinet. Not because he likes them, but because they are always there. One time he told me, this thing never runs out, until one day he stopped by his usual store. The shelf was still there but empty right at that spot. He stood there for a moment, then grabbed something else. When he got home, he did not open it. But if you think the problem is the price, you are looking in the wrong place. Price is only the surface signal. The real issue is that supply is becoming unstable. This week, the shelf still looks full. Next week, a few brands are missing. And then there are times when you come back to that exact spot and there is nothing there anymore. No notice, no warning. It simply disappears. And what is notable is, it does not start in the supermarket. It starts in the ocean. Many major fishing grounds have been forced to reduce catch quotas. Not because they want to manipulate prices, but because fish populations are actually declining. Ocean temperatures are shifting, currents are changing, spawning zones are being disrupted. Fish are no longer appearing where they used to. Fishermen cannot operate the same way. The drop in output is not due to one bad season, but because the underlying conditions are changing. And when global supply tightens, rising prices are only the first step. What disappears next is stability. It means you cannot know when the product will be available again, cannot predict where prices will stop, and cannot plan long-term for something that used to always be available. What makes sardines and mackerel important is not about feeling full, but about the nutritional value they provide. A small can contains high-quality protein, essential fats, and especially omega-3, one of the components many other canned foods cannot replace. Under normal conditions, you can get omega-3 from fresh fish and other sources. But when options narrow, when fresh food is no longer easy to access, sources like this become extremely important. And this is the part most people do not notice. A lack of omega-3 does not make you collapse immediately. It does not create a clear problem that day. It happens slowly, quietly, hard to detect. After a few weeks, you start to feel less focused, more irritable. Your energy becomes less stable. Your immune system responds more slowly. You still eat, still get enough calories, but the overall feeling is no longer the same. And because there is no clear signal, you do not know where the problem comes from. That is the danger. When the food system begins to shift, the problem is not whether you have enough food, but whether that food still allows your body to function properly. Sardines and mackerel are not something many people actively choose under normal conditions. In fact, many people avoid them. But during periods when choices are limited, they become one of the few foods that provide what the body needs in a simple form. Easy to store, no preparation required. And that is why you start to see them disappear in a very unusual way. Not gone across the entire system, but disappearing piece by piece. Gone from one store, then two stores, then an entire area. Not because people panic buy all at once in a single day, but because a small group recognized this earlier, and they only did one simple thing. Each time they shop, they add a few cans to their cart. You do not notice this change immediately, but when you start paying attention, it has already been happening for some time. And by the time you decide you should buy some too, you may no longer find it in the familiar spot. 8. Canned tomato products 95%. That is the share of processed tomatoes in the United States coming from a single region, California. Not 60 or 70%. Almost the entire supply depends on one place. And when one place has a problem, the entire system shakes. This does not happen loudly. It does not appear on the nightly news. It happens slowly, steadily, and is very easy to overlook if you are not paying attention. California is under pressure from multiple sides at once. Prolonged drought tightens water supply. Farmers cannot plant the same way, cannot irrigate the same way. Labor shortages slow down harvesting and processing. Operating costs rise from fuel, fertilizer, to transportation. But when costs rise, companies do not simply produce less. They produce differently. They adjust production lines, prioritize products that bring higher profit margins. And that is when smaller, low-cost tomato cans, which carry lower margins, begin to be reduced. The result is a very familiar pattern. Shelves do not empty immediately. This week you still see enough. Next week a few varieties are missing. Then small gaps begin to appear. And then one day, you stand in front of the shelf, where tomatoes should be, and it is completely empty. Not because the world ran out of tomatoes, but because that product is no longer prioritized to reach you. You do not see empty shelves right away. You just notice you no longer have the same choices as before. And this is the part many people underestimate. Tomato products are not the main food. No one lives on tomatoes alone. But they are what turn the simplest ingredients into real meals. White rice with plain water is just rice. But add a little tomato, spices, and fat. It becomes a complete dish. Canned beans on their own you can tolerate for a few days. But cooked with tomatoes, they become a stew. Pasta, canned vegetables, even the simplest foods. All change when this ingredient is present. If you have ever opened your pantry and felt like you had everything, but did not know what to cook, that is exactly the problem. You still have food, but you no longer have meals. And over time, that is not just about taste. It becomes a psychological issue. In a real-world test, the first week is still fine. You have enough calories, enough food. But by the second week, everything starts to feel the same. Not hunger, but monotony. You eat to fill up, not to eat. And that is when small ingredients like tomatoes become far more important than their apparent value. Without tomato products, you can still exist, but you lose the ability to sustain a long-term eating routine. You lose variety. You lose the desire to eat. And when that continues, your mindset starts to decline. You feel more tired, less motivated, and more likely to give up on maintaining a consistent eating routine. That is why when supply begins to shift, products like this disappear in a very unusual way. Not from panic, not because everyone rushes to buy on a single day, but because a small group recognized their real role, and they do not buy a lot at once. They just add a few cans each time they shop. Repeat it long enough, and the shelf begins to empty. You do not lose food. You lose the ability to turn it into something you want to eat. And that is when most people begin to give up. 7 canned butter. There are only a few manufacturers in the United States, not hundreds. A system that is already small, and when it encounters problems, the impact happens immediately. 1 factory fire, 1 shortage of metal cans for packaging. 2 factors that seem unrelated, but when they happen at the same time, supply drops faster than anyone expects. Meanwhile, demand does not stand still. More and more people are paying attention to long-term storage foods, and canned butter sits right in that category. The result is clear. Supply decreases, while demand increases. But what makes this item different is not that it is rare. It is how it completely changes the way you think about time. Fresh butter, even when stored properly, only lasts a few weeks to a few months before quality begins to decline. You can freeze it to extend that time, but flavor and texture will change over time. You can still use it, but you know it is no longer the same as before. Canned butter is different. 5 years, 10 years. No refrigeration, no dependence on electricity, no need for constant rotation. The same type of food, but time becomes completely different, and that is the point most people do not think about. You are not just buying food, you are buying time. You are buying the ability to not worry about it spoiling before you can use it. You are buying flexibility in situations you cannot control. When power is unstable, when shopping is no longer easy, when prices begin to fluctuate, items that can last long-term create a clear advantage. If you have ever opened your refrigerator and seen butter spoil before you finished using it, then you have already seen part of the problem. It is not that you lack food, you just lack the time to use it. And that is what canned butter solves. It stretches that time from a few weeks into many years. But butter is not just about time. It is fat. It helps the body absorb vitamins A, D, E, K. It provides energy. And more importantly, it creates the feeling of a real meal. A little butter can completely change the eating experience. Under normal conditions, that is a choice. But when food is limited, it is what helps you maintain a sense of stability. What is notable is that this change does not happen loudly. You do not see empty shelves immediately. You just see less. One store no longer has it. Another runs out. Somewhere else switches to pre-order. And when you ask when it will be available again, the answer is often unclear. That is not just a simple delay. It is a sign of a supply chain under pressure. And like other items on this list, those who recognize this early do not wait. They do not buy in bulk. They just add a few cans each time they shop. Repeat long enough, and the difference begins to show. You do not lose butter. You lose the ability to keep it long enough for it to still be useful. 6. Evaporated milk with pull tab. Evaporated milk with pull tab is disappearing in a way that is easy to overlook. Not gone all at once, but gradually thinning. A few cans not restocked. Small gaps appear. And then you come back and realize it is no longer in the familiar place. The cause is not at the supermarket. It is in how factories allocate milk supply. When costs rise and capacity is limited, they do not produce everything equally. They prioritize fast-moving, higher-margin products like fresh milk and cheese. Meanwhile, evaporated milk, especially the convenient pull-tab version, gets pushed to the bottom. And when a product stays at the bottom long enough, it begins to disappear. But here is the critical part. A can without a pull tab, in many situations, is almost useless. It sounds small, but in a simple situation, power outage, no can opener, or you are not in your familiar kitchen, you have food, but you cannot use it. And that is the difference most people only realize when it is too late. A pull-tab can means no tools needed, no preparation, no conditions required. Just open and use immediately. Under normal conditions, that is convenience. Under unstable conditions, that is survival capability. In terms of nutrition, evaporated milk is also different from what many people think. About 60% of the water has been removed, meaning energy and nutrients are concentrated into a smaller volume. A small can, but it can provide quick energy, easy absorption, and can be used even when you cannot cook. You can consume it directly. Mix it with water. Add it to coffee, oats, or whatever you have left. This is not just an ingredient. This is a ready-to-use food form. And because of that characteristic, it disappears in a very specific way. Not from panic, but from choice. When raw milk prices rise more than 20 to 30% over recent years, factories are forced to optimize every product line. And products that are convenient but lower margin, like pull-tab cans, are often the first to be cut. You still see evaporated milk, but not the type you need. That is when the real problem begins. You do not lack food. You lack the ability to use it when you need it most. And when that happens, everything changes very quickly. One day you still see everything available. The next day you have to look for tools. The day after, you no longer have a choice. No warning, no notice. Just a small detail disappearing from the system. And when you realize the difference between having and being able to use, that gap is enough to put you behind. 5. Honey large jars 3,000 years. That is not an exaggeration. Honey truly does not spoil the way most foods do. Not because of marketing, but because of chemistry. Its moisture is too low for bacteria to survive. Its pH is acidic enough to prevent growth, and it naturally produces hydrogen peroxide, a built-in antibacterial mechanism. The result is a food that almost exists outside the rules of time. But the issue is not shelf life. You do not lack honey. You still see it on the shelf. The problem is that the format you actually need is disappearing. Large jars. Before, you could buy honey in big containers, multi-pound jars, at a better price per unit. One purchase, used for months, even years. Today, you still see honey, but mostly in small jars. Higher price, smaller quantity. And if you try to find large formats, you start to realize they are no longer as common as before. This is not a coincidence. Bee populations have declined significantly over the past years, not due to a single cause, but a combination: pesticides, habitat loss, parasites, and climate change. Honey production has dropped. Domestic supply has weakened. At the same time, imports have been tightened due to adulteration issues. The result is that both domestic and imported supply are shrinking. When supply tightens, the market responds in a very familiar way, not by disappearing completely, but by changing structure. Retailers prioritize products with higher margins. and that often means smaller packaging. You still see honey, but not the type you need, not the price you are used to, not the volume that allows long-term storage. And this is the part many people overlook. Honey is not just a sweetener. It is one of the few foods that can be used in many different ways without special conditions. You can consume it directly. Use it in cooking. Soothe the throat. Even use it as a temporary solution for minor wounds, thanks to its antibacterial properties. In situations where choices are limited, that versatility becomes far more important. But most importantly is time. Most foods you buy begin counting down the moment you bring them home. Honey does not. It does not create pressure to use it quickly. It does not require constant rotation. It just sits there and retains its value. And that is exactly why those who understand this do not wait. They do not buy a lot at once. They simply choose the right format while it is still available. Because when large jars disappear, you do not lose honey. You lose the ability to buy it in a way that makes long-term sense. 4. Canned tuna. You do not think about tuna until you need a quick meal and it is no longer there. 3 years ago, a standard can of tuna cost around $1 to $1.5. Today, in many places, it is $2 to $3. Not a sudden jump, but enough to make you hesitate, instead of grabbing it like before. And that is only what you can see. Behind it, things are changing much faster. Tuna is not farmed. It is caught offshore by fleets that can stay at sea for weeks. When fuel prices rise more than 30 to 50% over recent years, each trip becomes significantly more expensive. Some vessels reduce trips, some stop going out entirely. And that happens before you see any gaps on the shelf. Output declines, but demand does not. When less fish reaches port, the entire chain behind it gets stretched. Processing, canning, transportation. Metal can prices rise, shipping costs increase, and manufacturers begin to adjust. Not stopping, but changing how they sell. Smaller cans, higher prices, fewer options. Not disappearing completely, just no longer stable. But this is the part you will feel most clearly. One evening, you do not want to cook. You open the cabinet, and there is nothing quick, nothing convenient. A can of tuna, something that used to always be there, is no longer there. Tuna is not just food, it is a time solution. A small can, but enough for a meal in minutes. No stove needed, no preparation required. Mix with rice, eat with bread, or consume directly. It works immediately. Under normal conditions, you do not notice. But when you are tired, busy, or without options, it is what keeps you stable. A can of tuna can provide about 20 to 25 grams of protein. When you lack protein, you do not notice immediately. You still eat, still get enough calories, but you tire faster, have difficulty concentrating, and your energy does not last. Not hunger, but deficiency. And when it is no longer stable, you do not just lose a meal. You lose a fallback option you never had to think about. This change is not loud. This week it is still there. Next week it is more expensive. Then fewer options. Then you have to search for something you used to just reach for. Tuna does not disappear, but it is no longer something you can take for granted. And when something that is always there starts to become uncertain, the problem is no longer on the shelf. 3. Canned beans. You think canned beans are the cheapest item and always available. The truth is, this is one of the products affected earliest when the system starts to shift. Not because it is rare, but because it is too cheap. When costs rise, from agriculture, transportation to metal cans, low-margin products like beans are the first to be cut. Manufacturers do not stop operating. They just change priorities, and simple cans of beans begin to thin out. You do not see it immediately. You just notice fewer choices. Prices edge up slightly. And sometimes, the familiar brand is no longer there. There is a comment I read recently. Someone said they grew up in poverty. Dinner did not need to be complicated. Rice, soup, whatever was in the pantry. Beans were always there, cheap, filling, easy to use. But now, the issue is no longer what is there to eat. It is whether you can still buy it the same way as before. That is the shift. Canned beans are not flashy, but they are a foundation. A can of beans can stand on its own or combine with anything you have left. And when choices narrow, you return to things like that. But this is the part many people overlook. How you use beans matters just as much as having them. Most people open the can, then drain the liquid. And unintentionally, they throw away part of the value. The liquid in beans is not just water. It contains starch, minerals, and can be used as a base to cook soup or thicken dishes. When you keep that part, one can of beans is no longer one serving. It becomes two. Another way, portion it out. Instead of using the whole can in one meal, you can divide it into 2 to 3 portions, combining with rice, pasta, or vegetables. This not only extends your food supply, but also preserves variety. The first thing most people lose when they start cutting back. And if you really want to optimize, there is an option many overlook: dry beans. Much cheaper per unit. Not dependent on metal cans. Can be stored longer if kept properly. But in exchange, you need time and water to cook. And that is the trade-off you need to understand clearly. There is no perfect option. Only the option that fits your conditions. That is what experienced people understand very well. They do not just buy food. They understand how to extend it, how to use it, and how to turn one simple item into multiple meals. And that is the real difference. Because when the cheapest items start to change, you no longer have much room for error. A small decision, like keeping the bean liquid or dividing portions, can create a bigger difference than you think. You do not lose food. You lose the way to use it efficiently. And when that happens, the problem is no longer what you have. It is how long you can make it last. If you had to live for a week with only what is in your kitchen, do you know how to turn one can of beans into more than one meal? 2. Canned meat spam. Canned meat 3 years ago. A common can of canned meat cost around $2.5 to $3. Today, the same product, $4 to $5, even higher depending on the area. Not a sudden increase, not attention-grabbing, but enough to change how people use it. What is interesting is that canned meat does not rise immediately when fresh meat prices increase. It always comes later. And that delay makes many people think it is stable. But in reality, it is just responding more slowly to the same pressure. When fresh meat prices stay high long enough, consumers begin to shift. They do not stop buying. They just change how they buy. And that is when canned meat starts to face real pressure. But this is the part that matters most. A can of canned meat is not one meal. If you use it properly, it can be 2 to 3 meals. The problem is most people open the can and use it all at once. That makes its real cost twice as high as necessary. A simpler approach: cut it into small pieces, pan fry until dry, then divide it. When you do that, you do not just extend the number of meals. You also change how it works in the meal. It is no longer the main dish. It becomes a base energy source, something that can combine with rice, pasta, or whatever you have left. This is the second mistake many people overlook. Storage after opening. Many people leave the remaining portion in the can and put it in the refrigerator. That allows metal to interact with air and moisture, causing the food to degrade faster. The correct way is to transfer it to a sealed container. Just one small change, but it can extend safe use by 2 to 3 days. And this is why canned meat is different from many other foods. It is not just protein. It is protein plus fat in a concentrated form. A small can, but it contains real energy. When you eat without enough fat, you will notice something clearly. You feel full, but get hungry again quickly. You eat, but do not have enough energy. Canned meat fills that exact gap. In a simple situation, a 24 to 48-hour power outage, you do not need complex cooking. You need something that works immediately. A can of canned meat plus leftover rice is still a complete meal. No preparation, no special conditions, but because it works so well. When meat prices rise, people return to it, not because they prefer it, but because they need something more efficient. And that is when you start to see the change. Not completely gone, but less, more expensive, and no longer the cheap option it used to be. Canned meat does not disappear, but its role is changing, from secondary to primary. And when that happens, how you use it will determine how long you can stretch it. If you had a can of canned meat right now, would you use it all in one meal or turn it into 3? 1. Canned fruit. You can live without fruit, but after just a few days, you will feel that something is not right. 3 years ago, a standard can of canned fruit cost around $1 to $1.5. Today, in many places, it is $2 to $3, even higher for better quality. Not because fruit is disappearing, but because this item is no longer prioritized. In the supply chain, when costs rise, the system does not keep everything. It chooses. Protein is kept. Starch is kept. The things that help you survive are prioritized first. Fruit, which provides vitamins, sweetness, and comfort, gets pushed down the list. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is not urgent, and that is why it disappears in a very unusual way. Not loudly, not suddenly. You still see fruit on the shelf, but fewer types, fewer choices, and if you look closely, familiar cans start to disappear. But this is what most people realize too late. After 3 to 4 days of eating salty canned food, dry food, the problem is not that you lack calories. You still eat enough, but you start to feel more tired, less willing to eat. Not because you are not hungry, but because everything feels the same. A can of fruit can change that. Not because of sugar, but because of how it feels. A little natural sweetness helps reset a meal. It makes simple food easier to eat. And over longer periods, that is not a luxury. It is what helps you keep going. But this is the mistake many people make. They pour away the liquid in the can. That liquid is not just water. It contains natural sugars, soluble vitamins, and can be used as part of the meal, mixed with oats, diluted to drink, or used as a base for something else. When you keep it, a can of fruit is no longer one item. It becomes 2. Another tip few people use: combine it. Canned fruit can be eaten on its own, but when combined with other foods, bread, oats, or even rice, it completely changes the experience. You do not need much. Just a little is enough to break the monotony. That is its real value, not isolated nutrition. but the ability to keep your eating system from collapsing psychologically. And because it is not essential, it gets cut first. You do not lose fruit. You lose what helps you keep eating when you no longer want to eat. And that is why experienced people do not wait until it disappears. They do not buy a lot. They simply keep the right type while it is still there. Because by the time you realize you need it, you may be left with choices you do not want to use. If you had to eat the same type of food for many days, would you still have something that helps you feel normal? None of the items on this list are rare. You have seen them hundreds of times, and that is exactly why you do not notice when they begin to change. Not disappearing immediately, just less, more expensive, harder to find. And each time that happens, you adapt until you realize the familiar options are no longer there. The problem is not whether you have food, it is whether you still control how you eat. You do not need to prepare perfectly. You just need to not start from zero when things change. If you had to choose 3 items from this list today, which ones would you keep?